Great. We're also going to record this session and upload it to our cheeky YouTube channel if it's really good, and hopefully it is. So our YouTube channel is psychologyatwork.blog. I'll put it in the comments. Okay, so we have workplace behavior. Absolutely, because where's personality stops, where behavior begins is fascinating. General application, the shadow self. It's always kind of fun, and how this explored, especially through dark side tools. Team dynamics. Absolutely. It's how different personalities play towards each other's strengths and dark sides, potentially. That's what makes it really interesting. On how this model works with having coaches show their authentic selves to get better coaching inputs. Now, that is authenticity, selves, coaching. It's a complex topic. I mean, from my perspective, I went to a whole conference which was all about like how much of yourself should you bring coaching. And my favorite book on this subject is Martin, Therapy and Coaching Skills, fourth edition. And then it just has one passage. However of much of you think is of benefit to the client according to your professional judgment. That's about it. Aspects and basic overview. Can test, retest, both. And we have several on aspects. General application, employee well-being, adapting coaching style. Absolutely. If you're highly extroverted, how do you deal with highly introverted coachees? And how do you take care of yourself to make it sustainable? Recruitment, maybe. Interesting. From which side are you being recruited, or are you recruiting? General understanding for Big Five for my leadership development, how to navigate corporate life. Oh my goodness. Corp life. Yeah, that's a good acronym. So, first of all, we would not be able to answer all of these questions today, but I can point you to some resources. So if you like audiobooks, there's a brilliant one called Why You Are Who You Are by Leary. Why You Are Who You Are, Leary. It's on Audible, great courses. This is my favorite resource on all things personality psychology. It's 21 lectures. They're all half an hour. They're absolutely amazing. Uh, it also comes with a really nice PDF document of downloadable goodness. Ta, 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 ta. If you're interested in psychometrics and selection, so as you mentioned, recruitment, my favorite resource is this book. It's Personality Testing in Employee Selection by Monroe. Here's a link to Amazon. Absolutely fantastic, written in a really understandable way, full of anecdotes, full of criticisms. Don't you just love it? And if you're buying Psychometrics, I highly recommend getting these books because you can grill the hell out of your sales rep from the Psychometric publisher. So if you only be asking all the nitpicky questions and scoring brownie points with your colleagues because you go, oh my God, I did not think of that. That is the book to read. And just a little bit of self-promotion. We made a book with called Personality User's Guide, Yankov Mikhailov. So this one goes into depth of how to use psychometrics, Big Five, as far as development, coaching, working with teams, all of that. So that's there. So if you want to pick yourself up a copy afterwards, I would very much appreciate it. Okay. By the way, can you enlighten me? What's MNC? If you can unmute yourself and share. Or pop it in the chat. I'll have to rely on Google. Okay, what psychometric tools are you familiar with? Multinational corporations. Thank you so much, Nipur. Because that's what's really fun. You have the organizational culture, you have the national culture, and how they interact. And I always say you cannot spell organizational culture without using the word cult. And there's a hint in it because some companies are more cultish than others. So which psychometrics? MBTI, the kitchen test. Sorry, I never heard about this iteration of MBTI. Can you expand?
Hello, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay. I'm working, so I'm multitasking.
Brilliant.
But the way it came up and the way it was developed, and I regard it as a kitchen test in a way. It gives you some ideas, but at the same time, scientifically, I'm not sure that we should rely on it.
Well, I'm not sure you scientifically should rely on any psychometric alone by itself. And it depends for
Exactly.
what. So, from my perspective, there is nothing wrong with MBTI. As far as I'm aware, the questionnaire itself is really valid and it's good, but the issue becomes is how they identify type by basically if you're on this side or that side. Sometimes you flip. But from my perspective, what's really fun is because people have done MBTI many times before, usually. And when you sit down with the client, asking them, have you done it before? And what letters do you remember? And usually people with more prominent traits will remember those letters, such as, for example, if somebody's highly extrovert with no introversion, they'll come up with, I'm an extrovert, or vice versa. I think it can be useful. But in what kind of cases you use it yourself?
I don't use it as much, but once upon a time, as part of the leadership, the executives said so offered to pay for it and provided that we share the results. And I want to say that I came as an extreme extrovert, but I'm on a spectrum. I'm not an extreme extrovert. I like sitting by myself with classical music and so on. And sometimes I'm quiet. I straight away, it's like, but my background is physics. So I find it quite hard to trust things until there is data, the concrete data. So that's why I sort of call it. But at the same time, it is nice to see where on the spectrum approximately you are.
Exactly. It can be useful, but I feel your pain. My dad is a professor of applied mathematics and physics. Whenever I tell him psychology is a science, put it this way, there's a disagreement, but that's for my therapy sessions, not here. But yes, it is really kind of key how you use it and when. And this introversion, extroversion, it is useful, but it's sometimes problematic because I always say, for example, introverts are just extroverts with good taste. They're just more selective of when they want to be extroverted and what do they care about. And by the sounds of it, you're an extrovert with good taste, as far as you like be alone and listen to classical music.
But
So,
at the same time, you know what I say, that as an extrovert, and I am an extrovert, I understand that. I feel discriminated. If in the meeting, let's say I can talk, think, and make decisions, and introverts can't, but very often, like what we say, we discriminate against introverts, but that's not true. Nowadays, I find that it discriminates against me. If I speak, I'm loud, I'm bossy, I'm all that stuff that extroverts are, and we have to adjust to introverts. That's
exactly.
just one idea, and that's working in corporate life, and that's what taught me that actually the discrimination is the other way around. We need to shut up. We need to adjust. There are narcissists and all that stuff, extreme things, yeah, but I'm not about extremes. Thank you.
That's a brilliant point. And there's a couple of things you mentioned which are fascinating. So, first of all, is which side is preferred and why by the culture. So, for example, with highly extroverts, absolutely, we need to shut up sometimes. Whenever I say any questions, I count to 15 inside my head before continuing because my default setting is any questions, good, moving on. Same as introverts need to speak up because otherwise I'm not psychic. But I read this fantastic ancient Chinese proverb on Facebook, so I know it's true. And that is there is 10 steps between every two people, and it's up to each one to make five. So it's how we meet in the middle. And you mentioned this word bossy. Now, I have two daughters, and we don't police language around their house. But this word bossy is never allowed here because that's a gender stereotype. I have never, in my 12-year career working one-to-ones, I have never had a male client use that word to describe themselves. It's almost like a penalty that's imposed on women for speaking out. It's like if you show drive and determination, you're labeled as bossy. A male shows the same traits, labeled as a natural born leader. Same behaviors, gender stereotypes.
Exactly, assertive. But would you use the word and I have to say, I'm assertive. Yes, I can hold my own ground, but I'll be polite, respectful. I don't use personal attacks and so on. But at the same time, you want it or you don't want it. This stereotyping against women is there and is more prevalent as you want to go up in your career. When I was a middle manager or just a beginner manager, let's say, or a technical person, I was saying, oh, there is no glass ceiling. And as soon as I started going up, I can see it. I'm sort of saying I'm slapped on my head nearly on a daily basis.
Exactly. And it's all kind of very kind of not that explicit. It's like by 1,000 cuts.
Exactly.
Yeah, and this is one of the key things when we talk about Big Five is cultural experience of the individual, stereotypes, gender, the way it might be impacted. And this is something to unpack around it. And all of these lovely assessments give a step towards it. By the way, anybody who likes to get more information on Hogan or Lumina, we run additional sessions specifically on those tools. So I just popped them into the chat. So feel free to sign up to them. All of them are free. Also, if any of you want to complete Spark, we can make it happen. Anybody wants to try Neo, Hographer was very kind to potentially offer this. And if you want to just try some psychometrics for yourself, drop me a LinkedIn message and I can spam you with a few assessments. Great. So as we move on, there's lots of different psychometric assessments out there. There's ability assessments. There's personality assessments. There's culture psychometrics. There's implicit bias assessments. Nupur, if you're interested in Hogan assessments, pop me a message. Members of the Academy get a discount, which is much greater than the fee for our annual subscription. Culture psychometrics, implicit association tests. There's lots of different assessments out there. And those assessments take many forms. You have self-report, such as Spark, Neo, and this is what's really interesting. Spark, Neo, Facet 5 will all say they're Big Five assessments, but there's no such thing as a Big Five assessment. There's assessments based on the Big Five. So Big Five is a model which we'll get into in 5 minutes, and all the different assessments take slightly poetic licenses, let's say, on the way they interpret it. So the way Lumina interprets Big Five, the way Facet 5 interprets Big Five, the way Neo interprets Big Five is all slightly different. Then you have 360 assessments. So when you rate yourself and other people rate you. So that's assessments like LMAP, which we'll be talking about on Wednesday, or Lumina Leader. You also have game-based assessments like Arctic Shores. Now you have chat-based assessments like Mackie People. You have projective assessments like Rorschach. And now, of course, everything is drizzled with AI, which can stand for anything you want. So it's a bit like Rorschach. So, however, psychometrics are nothing new. We have been struggling with this concept of self for a very long time. In ancient China, 200 years BC, there were assessments for selection for civil service. They even had several assessments in a row, and they had little testing booths in which people could fill out those assessments. So we had assessment centers for literally over 2,000 years as humans. And no surprise, BPS only looked at the guidelines for them 5 years ago. BPS is British Psychological Society. Then, in my opinion, the Zodiac is the first personality assessment that we know of. You get asked one question and you get 12 types. And Leos are clearly the best. And but what's really important here is when people go, "Oh, Zodiac," I go, "Did you ever?" Psychometricians who are like, "Oh my God, how dare you say this?" I go, "Did you ever check out a horoscope app?" and just how more sophisticated it is than any psychometric app I have seen. The horoscope people are way ahead of us when it comes to UX. So yeah, anyways, but that's a different hobby course, probably for a conference and a pub. But the thing is that, what's the first question? Like, what's in it this week for me? Oh, SHL tests are also present. They're doing some interesting stuff right now. Savile Wave launched Connect. So yeah, if you're interested in SHL on our YouTube channel, I'll pop a link. We have interview with Peter Savile, so the co-founder of SHL and Savile Assessments. Sadly passed away. If you really want, if you have an SHL practitioner or somebody who really cares about their assessments, I have a very sneaky birthday present for them, and that is Testing Times by Peter Savile. It's a great book. It's his memoir, which he published shortly before he died. Um, yeah, will do. I will definitely share the link. So then what we have is, so we have the Zodiac. Then we have Disc. So, by the way, I love Disc. Like, I absolutely love it. But not necessarily for the reasons people think I might love it. The reason I love Disc is that to me, it's the best illustration I ever seen that psychometric models tell you more about the author than it does about your client. Because Disc was published originally as a model in a book called Emotions of Normal People in 1920s. Okay, so by a guy called Marston. Now Marston believed that the true aspiration of a man, was to be lovingly dominated by a woman. And Disc, originally D stood for need to dominate, and S stood for need to submit. Now, he also created Wonder Woman, if you're familiar with that character. And with her lasso of truth, if she ties you up, you cannot lie. Hmm? And he also presented the lie detector test. Now, Peter Savile in his book argues that he didn't actually create the lie detector test, he nicked it from a copper in the States. But that's Peter Savile. So here's actually an interview with him. So please subscribe to our YouTube channels. There's lots of goodness. So what does a lie detector test requires you to be done to you? You're strapped into a chair for the duration of the process. So let's look at this. Strapped into a chair, lasso of truth, lovingly dominated by a woman. You don't need to be a Freudian analyst to notice a pattern. Marston had a kink. There's nothing wrong with having a kink. But maybe this belongs in the bedroom, not the boardroom. And maybe it has to do more with eurythmics. Some people want to be used by you than psychometrics. Just asking. But the key thing here is that all these models are written by humans, and they tell you more about the authors than it does about your clients. And what's also really important, that Marston never created this. He only created a model. And somebody in the 60s took their model and their writing and created a psychometric based on it. 1940s, we had MBTI, 1944 actually. So when people criticize MBTI, I go, for 1944, it was great. But it's the same way, you can't really go to Curry's, that's a electronic shop in UK, and go, you know what, I really want to stream Netflix, but I want a black and white model from 1944. You know, it shows the same stuff, right? Great. But then you got this model, but it doesn't give you Netflix. So people asking MBTI to do what it wasn't built for in 1944, whose problem is this? You wanted Netflix from a black and white television, or a black and white television problem? So the key thing is things have moved on. And MBTI, OPP, Myers-Briggs Company did a fantastic job in updating the instrument. They did a fantastic job with publishing research, which is peer-reviewed. And MBTI has so much more research behind it than people think. And whenever people actually go, we need to use AI personality models, it's more scientific. Actually, on a lot of those models, nobody publishes anything, not to mention something that's peer-reviewed. MBTI has been doing fantastic work in publishing peer-reviewed research than a lot of these companies who actually claim to be more scientific. So please take it with a pinch of salt. And a lot of criticism which are currently directed to MBTI are applicable to every psychometric. So it's a bit not that great. And to me, I think that also to what extent MBTI is one of the few assessments which are created by women, a mother and daughter's team. Almost other psychometrics are created by men. So I think that to what extent there's a bit of sexism going on here. And rather than actually, MBTI is great, especially for 1944. And also, if MBTI wasn't there, wouldn't be sitting here today talking about personality. Because MBTI has been the tool which got into corporates across 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s and created this acceptance of personality and personality assessments within the workplace. So when you're criticizing MBTI, be aware you might be cutting the branch you sit on. Uh, oh, thank you. Snezhana, am I pronouncing the name correctly?
Yeah, yes, Snezhana.
Excellent. Sorry, I get self-conscious about names. And then in 1980s, we had Big Five, NEO, OPQ, and gamified assessments. So what is this? And when you buy different psychometrics, always look at reliability, validity, questions like when people say, when people like, oh, this is correlated with performance. When and with which performance? Like if you're hiring people for an investment bank, maybe they're real estaters from Ohio being correlated with performance on that assessment is not that relevant for you. And also, what's pro tip, always check the items of the questionnaire. Some questionnaire items are really weird. If they don't make sense to you, they're not going to make sense to your client. So this is something you can explore. I'll share the recording, hopefully. So just something to be concerned about when using assessments. On the previous question about neurodiversity, here's the two studies I would highly recommend. So it's Gomez and Carr, ADHD and personality, and Laddie and Smith, meta-analysis of big five personality traits in autism spectrum disorder. I like those. And look, this has been looked at 10 years ago. So there's plenty more studies. Also, here's a pro tip. When you look at something in Google Scholar and you find the study from like 2014, check who it has been cited by, because then you get all the relevant studies which have cited that study up to this point. Could be really fascinating. Excellent, Nupur. Absolutely. And it is a fascinating area to explore. Okay, so now we're going to move into, actually, let's skip a couple of these questions and let's move into the big five. So first of all, what's really interesting about personality psychology, now we're going to explore a personality model, which is called the big five model. But before we go into it, as I described, most model tells you more about the authors than it does about your clients. Second thing I want to say is that how can you tell a popular article on psychology is likely to be crap? And it's simple. It starts with the following words. Psychologists agree. We don't agree on anything, really. And therefore, what I'm about to present you is just a theory. It can be useful, it can be practical, but it's just a theory. And in 5 to 10 years, we might be talking about the big six. There's already an argument that there's another factor called humility. There might be the big eight. We might be talking about the 10 aspects that Ken mentioned to in the beginning. We don't know what's going to happen because that's the benefit of being as part of a science. Our understanding of the field evolves as our research progresses. So also what's really fun about personality, it's really hard to define what it is. So for our book, just a little plug there, we researched many definitions of personality, but there's dozens of them. Plus there's cross-cultural difference. Saim, I noticed you're unmuted yourself. Was that a wrong click or were you about to jump in on something?
No, wrong click, wrong click.
Ah, damn. So what are your thoughts on personality, Saim?
I mean, my thoughts on personality, it could affect everywhere or environment. I'm not very an academic, so my definition is very general, I guess.
Nice. So general and practical, let's say,
Yeah, yeah.
and context specific.
And application based, if yeah.
Well, can you expand what you mean by advocation based?
Well, like when I think of personality, I think of more like how it affects other people, how our personality affects the people around us and in the workplace sometimes.
That is so considerate of you.
Yes, I'm
So
considerate.
exactly. So probably in line with your personality.
Yes.
Uh, Now, what's really important here is that it's the context which is so key. Because, for example, what we have here is how we structure personality. So my colleague Georgi, who surprised me being very humanistic, defined personality as yourself developing itself in our book. But for me, personality breaks down into several aspects. So first of all, there's different versions of you. So in a room of 27 people as we are right now, there's 27 versions of you. There's how one you see yourself and how other people interpret your behavior and how they see you. It often tells you more about them, how they see you, than it does about you. And we did some cheeky research with Living a couple of years ago to indicate that. But what's really important here, especially leadership style, but what's really important here is how you see yourself and how other people see you is a fascinating area to explore within the team. Because what happens like when somebody tells you something that doesn't agree with your self-narrative? You go, that's not me. So when my wife goes, Nick, you're being argumentative, my response is, no, I'm not, because I think I'm being logical. And it's how we're perceived. And this whole thing is compared to our self-narrative, is who we think we are. So we have the story we tell ourselves who we are. So when I sit down with a client, my first question to them, after we, of course, we introduce ourselves and why we're here, is how would you describe yourself? How would you describe your personality? Because ultimately, you work with the narrative a person has about themselves. Doesn't matter what tool you use, Hogan, OPQ, Savile, they just answered questions about themselves. So what you're working with is a self-narrative and how it is represented or not represented in the report that you're using. Second question I usually ask is, what do people sometimes get wrong about your personality? Because that might be indicative of these changes and how other people perceive you. Then, as Sai mentioned, as far as context and workplace, I also ask, what aspects of your personality you consciously manage at work, and why do you think it's necessary to do so? Because that's also quite fun to explore. And because to me, personality exists basically on 5 levels. There's what you like, your preference. There's a behavior, what you do. There's maladaptive, what you do too much. There's aspirational, who you want to be. And there's other funds like, 360, perception, EQ. As my friend Paul Harris says, it's very hard to define what emotional intelligence is as a psychological construct, but it's crystal clear when people don't have it. So how did Big Five originate? It originated by 2 gentlemen called Allport and Odbert. In 1930s in America, they were interested in what the French were doing, like BNA with intelligence testing, and they thought, you know what, let's come up with a personality assessment. But where should we start? And so it said, let's go psycholexical. So psycholexical is a psychology of language. So the theory was, if there's some word to describe some difference between me and Maria, if there's some difference between us, there should be a word for it by now. So if there's any difference between people, there should be a word for it. And so they picked out the English dictionary in 1930s, and they picked out every word they felt had to do with personality, character, and differences. Any guesses how many words they picked out? Saim, is it 5, 500, 5,000, 50,000? What 5? 5 what?
Guessing 5.
5 words.
I'm guessing 5 with the theme of this presentation.
Close. It was actually 17,908. So yeah. So after this, 50 years proceeded. So they looked at how this was correlated, and there was 16 PF published in 1949 based on this research. But mainly towards 1980s, we arrived at the Big Five model. So what are the Big Five? Now, like I said, this is just now. So in 5 years' time, we might be talking about the Big Six. 10 years' time, Big Three. We don't know. But for now, this is just a model. So we have the Big Five. So first we have neuroticism. So neuroticism is a propensity for negative emotional impact. So basically what it's shown is that all the 17,908 words gravitate around 5 factors. So there's 5 points of gravity. So first one is neuroticism. So it's negative emotional stimuli. So people who are highly neurotic tend to experience negative emotions more often, stronger, potentially, and all of that. But people low in neuroticism, it's not that they're not neurotic. As our friend Gordon Curfey, and he's not a Freudian analyst, says, the level of neuroticism is the length of your fuse. You can put up with more negative emotions before blowing your fuse and exploding. So you need more negative stimuli till you have a negative emotional reaction. And some of us are highly neurotic, Some of us are really low in neuroticism, but most of us are in the middle. You have that lovely standard distribution. And what's really important with neuroticism when coaching, neuroticism is it exists on 3 pillars in my practice. So it's anecdotal. So one pillar is negative emotional construct, the self-construct, self-narrative. So you're very hard on who you think you are. So that self-narrative you have of you, you're very critical of yourself. So it's highly correlated with inner critic, imposter syndrome. But do you know the good news is, so anybody here has imposter syndrome or inner critic? I know I have. Anybody else? Maria, thank you. Nupur, lovely. Maybe just one more. Sarah, fantastic. Rachel, lovely. You know what's really good news about having it? You're not likely to be a psychopath. Psychopaths don't have it. Psychopaths are not critical of yourselves. They don't have an imposter syndrome, nothing like that. So next time you're really hard on yourself, you can go, well, at least I'm not a psychopath. You know, the bright side to it. But how it might show up in coaching, you might ask. Well, think about what's happening right now in a lot of companies. The annual performance review, the wonderful corp life aspect where it makes sense to give you feedback only once a year on your work. So when people get performance review, because they have this negative self-construct, they're more likely to look for negative stimuli about themselves. It's called confirmation bias. It's not just when you use Google. So we're likely to seek out information which confirms our biases. So if you have a negative bias against yourself, you're more likely to seek out negative stimuli about yourself. So your clients might go immediately to negative, what they could do better. So even if they looked at the positives, in a week or 2 weeks' time, they will forget half of the positives, all the negatives. In a month's time, they will remember none of the positives, only the negatives. So one of the things to do with a client, I always ask in between coaching sessions, can you print out a couple of your performance reviews and take 2 markers of different colors? One to highlight the positives and one to highlight development areas. And if your clients are especially conscientious, we'll get onto that, ask them to write a little article on it, like a little research piece as a summary. So it helps them kind of process the both areas. Now, if you deal with clients who are highly less neurotic, the question becomes how they deal with more neurotic colleagues. Because what's a good indication you're low on neuroticism? You keep telling your friends, colleagues, and spouses, stop overreacting. And does it ever work? No, unlikely, because they're not overreacting. They're just reacting. It's from your perspective, they're overreacting. So then the question is, how you can acknowledge that, work with their negative emotional stimuli, like saying, as Esther Perel says, and every criticism lies a wish. So you can say, look, I hear you're anxious about this. I hear you're angry about this. And what would you like instead to happen? So kind of working with this can be interesting. The key thing is that neuroticism is the most malleable out of all of it. Oh, Esther, absolutely lovely. Her podcast, Where Should We Begin, is brilliant. It's one of recordings of couple sessions. Brilliant for Valentine's Day in many ways. Well, if you're that inclined. But another key thing with neuroticism is it's the most malleable of the big 5. So it's the most changeable. So if you take better care of yourself, your neuroticism goes down as well. So from 18 to 30, it goes down quite a bit. But what's also important, it's the most changeable. So over your lifetime, your neuroticism will go down by average by 1 standard deviation. But if you go to therapy, for example, therapy, even for a few weeks, few months, reduce your neuroticism by half a standard deviation. So by going to therapy, you actually achieve reduction half of the neuroticism as you reduce over your lifespan. So it can be a really good cost-effective way. Plus, if you haven't tried therapy, in my opinion, therapy is bliss. It's 50 minutes to talk about yourself without any interruption. But that probably brings us to the next aspect, which is called extroversion. So extroversion is, we already mentioned it. So Snezhana mentioned it. Extroversion, introversion, ambiversion in the middle. So people who are highly extroverted need more stimuli. So this has to do with a thing called cortical arousal. So it's how much stimuli your brain needs from its senses to feel engaged with the world around you. So extroverts have a higher threshold. They need more stimuli. introverts can put up with less stimuli and feel equally engaged. So in an open plan office, I always say it's quite easy to spot the extroverted colleague. I call it the meerkat effect. So the moment they're understimulated, they'll stand up and they start looking around who they can talk to. And it's nothing personal. It's just a little bit of interaction to get that stimuli. And God forbid it's an introverted colleague who's having a coffee between meetings and looking outside the window and recharging. And the extrovert goes, ooh, they must be lonely. So, and they come up and talk to them. So the key thing here is that with extroversion, you have that higher need for stimuli. So they tend to talk more, they tend to talk faster. And whenever I see posts on LinkedIn, top 5 things that take no effort, listening is always the first one. I go, not if you're a bloody extrovert. It takes so much effort to shut up sometimes. So it's just the question of that stimuli. Then with introverts, it takes a lot of effort to speak up sometimes. So often introvert might feel, especially if they're a bit low on openness, conscientious, they might feel, look, I need to know something before I say it. So they think about it inside their head rather than presenting or sharing in a meeting, but then the moment is gone and they don't say anything. So with clients like that, I go, but could you present it as a question? So instead of saying this, you can say, what about this? So you can present it quicker so it's in the moment. Also, for both introverts and extroverts, it's a question of how much energy it takes. So for extroverts, it takes energy to listen. For people highly introverted, it takes energy to speak up. So how do you manage your energy? This is one of the key things I work with my clients. So for extroverts, if it takes you effort to listen, what the point of 60-minute one-to-ones if you're only paying attention for the first 15? Scheduled half an hour. Same for introverts. If you need to present and you scheduled lots of meetings in the day before your presentation, you're going to be exhausted. So how you manage your diary to help with that? So for highly extroverted clients, if you can only do 3 meetings one-to-ones a day, schedule 3 meetings. If you're a morning person, do it in the morning. Afternoon, evening, when possible, time zones allowing. With highly introverts, make sure the diary gives you prep time and decompression time after you present. So it's how you make it work for each other. That's what's really key. And with super high extroverted colleagues, I always say, look, next time you feel particularly generous, like not only don't interrupt people, but after they finish talking, if you really want to push the boat out, I mean, really push the boat out, say, is there anything else you would like to add? So it's how you make it work. If you're interested in the topic of extroversion, introversion, I highly recommend a book by Susan Cain, Quiet. Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. Really good reads for both sides. It's only a $5 on Amazon, well worth the price. So pick it up at your local Waterstones. Now we move on to openness. So people high on openness tend to be more expressive, more kind of looking around and stuff like that. Oh, sorry, I completely missed that. I'm still an extroversion. People high on openness tend to be more kind of, let's put it this way, creative in their thinking. Because they're not necessarily creative in actions, they're creative in their thoughts. So they tend to be more abstract, more conceptual, more imaginative, more radical, challenges the status quo. Now, people lower on openness tend to be more pragmatic. But when people high on openness tell me, but Nikita, I am so attentive, I'm so evidence-based. I go, yeah, you have an idea first and then you look for evidence to support it. Oh yeah, that's me. So people low on openness look for a problem first and reality and then think what can be done differently. And people high on openness first think what can be done differently, then look at the reality. The way this open shows up in coaching is micromanagement. I love the concept of micromanagement. So people high on openness, when before they felt oppressed, that they were just overly managed, breathing down my neck. So when they get into positions of leadership, I'm not going to micromanage anyone ever. But when they're briefing people, their mind is likely to experience what's known as lateral thinking. So they can go from A to D and miss B and C between A and D. So they can go A, D, Z, X, any questions, great. Moving on. But people don't get the best ideas. They can only get the ideas they understand. So people who are very pragmatic didn't get that guidance. And the high opens, but I don't want to micromanage them. But if they need more pragmatism, more guidance, and more detail, what the high openness person sees as micromanagement, the more pragmatic person sees as just management. So this kind of thing plays out quite often. So, for example, asking your colleague to play back what they've heard, presenting it in a way they understand. And next time you're presenting to a big audience, if you have a colleague who keeps asking you all these nitty-gritty questions when you're presenting and messing with your flow, buy them a coffee the day before and say, look, I really appreciate your attention to detail. Can we just go through the slides together and can you say something's missing? They can go, well, between slide 3 and 4, I can't get how you got there. And they can go, well, actually, this is how. And so you put extra slides in detail. So you have more chance of capturing more pragmatic people when you present. And same if you're low on openness and you're struggling, man, how do I get out of this situation? How we can change this? Go to a high openness colleague and buy them a coffee and say, look, what would you do? Look, there's 100 things you can do. And maybe half of one is implementable, but that's good enough because it's how we support each other. That's key. Then we move on to agreeableness. Agreeableness is how caring and empathetic you are to people around you. So how nice you play with others. High agreeable people tend to be empathetic and caring pretty much with everybody they meet. It's a default setting. You're trusting and empathetic from the get-go. With low accommodating people, trust, empathy is earned, not given. So whenever I see posts, we should make workplaces people more empathetic. I don't believe you can do that after 12 years. I don't think you can make people care about what they don't care about, and you can't force them. But you can make people kinder in their actions, more considerate, absolutely. But they won't necessarily care. I'll give you an example. I was working with a team. The lead of the team scored like 1 percentile empathy, 99 percentile logic. I had to check his ears. He wasn't a Vulcan. He wasn't. But he goes, I disagree with this. And the rest of the team was like, no, he's the most empathetic leader we ever had. And I was like, what sort of leaders you had before? At the back of my mind. But I said, no, well, John. Let's call him John or James. Statistically likely, those were the names. But the question here is, so I explained, like, look, you have the in-group, close friends, close colleagues. And to them, you'll kill and die for. Outside of this group, it's not that you're antagonistic or misanthropic to others. You just don't need an emotional bond to work with them. Because, oh yeah, that's me. And the person next to him goes, John, that's really mean. He turns to them and he goes, but you're part of the in-group. What is your problem? So it's this differentiation between in-group and out-group. And also you can have too little empathy and care, and you can have too much, such as if you trust people too much. My favorite quote is from BoJack Horseman. It's funny. When you look at people through rose-tinted glasses, all the red flags appear like ordinary flags. So is that question how you can coach the client either to be a little bit less empathetic and trusting, or potentially a little bit more kinder in their actions and delegation. And then we'll move to last but not least is conscientiousness, strengths of drive and purpose. When you have lots of conscientiousness, you have a lot of willpower. So the benefit is you can do stuff you don't like. The danger is you can do it for a long time. Low conscientiousness, you have a little bit of willpower, maybe half hour a day. So you need like deadlines to keep you motivated. So with people who are highly conscientious, they can, the way I work with a client, I ask them like, when do you start a project? When you get the brief, when the deadline comes? And they go, when I get the brief. So they're highly conscientious, they start. But the wait for low conscientious, wait till the end. So imagine if they need to kind of wait till the deadline. So the highly conscientious person does their part of the job, and the low conscientious is not starting. So they get stressed and they do their part of the work. 3 hours before the deadline, the low conscientious goes, why did you do my work? You go, because you weren't starting it. But we have plenty of time. We have 3 hours. I do my best work 2 hours before the deadline. And the highly conscientious, it's no time, it's already done. And the issue is it's not addressed. So the next project, it starts the same again. So it plays out again. It's like Groundhog Day, but there's no Bill Murray, so it isn't funny, especially for the highly conscientious person who does all the work. So this is just a slight indication of how Big Five can be used in coaching. What we will have starting probably February is a whole 5-lecture course on how to use each one of them in coaching. So 2 hours on each one of the Big Five. The course is going to be online. It will be free for our Psychometric Academy members who pay an annual subscription. And the course will cost £150 plus VAT if you're in UK for non-members. So you can either pay $295 for the year and get all the goodies, discounts, free assessments, all that good stuff, or you can pay 150 for the course and just attend the 5 lectures. They will be recorded, so if you miss one, you can complete it. We'll also include a few psychometrics to complete along the way. So hopefully this was a little bit of a taster and a little bit of indication of things to come if you want to proceed. If you're interested either in the course or joining the academy or anything I mentioned today which caught your eye, just pop this in the comments or message me on LinkedIn and I'll get back to you. But before we finish, it'd be great to hear 1 or 2 of your takeaways. So, Snezhana, thank you so much for sharing your experiences on extroversion, introversion biases. What are your takeaways from today?
Perception, how you are perceived. Yes, how we, being an extrovert, I do manage how people see me. So if you don't know me, you would not know that I'm actually a very soft person inside. You would see this armor that is put on as soon as I go to work. Yeah. And I sort of, maybe I need to open it up a little bit. But you also, like when you hear neuroticism, you think that, oh my God, it sort of has quite a negative connotation. Yeah. But now what I found out from you that actually is malleable. And I picked up counseling because it helps me with my career, with my life. I don't burden others. And I want to say for over a year of counseling, that my neuroticism came down. So you sort of, it was a confirmation bias, what you said here. It was really interesting. Thank you.
Absolutely, and armor helps, especially if you're highly neurotic and also in the culture. Like one of the ex-CEOs of Intel, I believe, wrote a book, Only the Paranoid Survive. Or as Robert Hogan says, our more contempt ancestors got eaten. Neurotic traits serve us well sometimes not so much. And I think it's important to value both. So one of the things with neuroticism, anxiety, perception of risk, it's what Bernard Shaw wrote. And that society needs both the pessimist and the optimist. The optimist invents the airplane, the pessimist the parachute. And it's how we can kind of work together. That's what's really key. So thank you so much from your reflections. And last but not least, Maria, Magda, what's your takeaways? Sarah, if you can just unmute yourself and then we'll close. Oh, Sarah, yeah.
Hi, yeah, no, I just put it in the group chat. Thank you, it's really interesting. I really like your comments on the neuroticism as well, and that being the most sort of, I guess, coachable and changeable dimension. And as a psychologist, I should have known that, but it's been really helpful takeaway for me to think more about. Thank you.
Excellent. The irony is that it's most malleable if you're really hard on yourself. Least likely you think you deserve self-care and stuff like that. So it has this catch-22 angle to it. And it's how you can kind of work with the client. So for me, when working with a client, I'd leverage their other aspects, such as if they're high openness, I'd like, let's experiment and be curious about this. If they're high agreeable, who would else benefit from you being less neurotic? So or conscientiousness, how can you structure it? Like how you can write a list of things you can do for yourself, stick it on the fridge. So it's how you can leverage the other 4 of the big 5 to help people navigate their neuroticism and override this catch-22. That's what really becomes fun. So anyways, if any questions, all of that good stuff, please connect with me on LinkedIn, ping me a question. We have more events coming up. Thank you, Snezhana, for that you're reading our book, and I'm really happy about that. Yeah. And by the way, as far as, let me just stop recording because I don't want to commit to that.